there is both an economic and indeed a cultural reason for objecting to immigration on the scale that we've had it since 1997. It just changes society too fast and is economically regressive. The economics of immigration is pretty neutral, actually. If you read all the literature as I had to do to write this book, the economics of immigration is pretty neutral when it comes to employment, wages, per capita GDP, and so on. It's pretty neutral, except that it is regressive, okay? It's neutral but regressive. So people in the upper part of the income spectrum, employers, do better from it than people in the bottom end.
I feel I have something to say. Look, I mean, yes, okay, but you've just enlisted an argument about economics and about workers' rights in order to talk about, you know, narrowing sort of migration flows. But the argument isn't about, you know, it's about workers' rights. It's about national minimum wage. It's about properly funding and properly respecting people who do that kind of work. It's not about, and when you fund that properly and when people are paid that wage, then, you know, that sort of cheap labour migration flow decreases anyway. If you make it impossible to exploit those...
Minimum wage attracts...
Well, no. If you make it impossible to exploit, if you make it impossible to exploit cheap labour at under minimum wage, then those migration flows that are paid under minimum wage, they stop. It's very, very clear. You're making an argument about workers' rights.
Eastern Europeans are not being paid under the minimum wage. They're doing normal jobs.
They're
attractive here because we have, by their standards, extremely high minimum wage, and they also get...
Yes, but that's an argument for work. That's an argument for. But that's an argument for equal. But that's an argument for redistribution across the European Union. Then it's not an argument about stopping migration flows. There is an economic way to do this. It doesn't have the negative consequences of stoking fears about migration, which include people stabbed in the street. In the immediate
absolutely ridiculous. You are blaming people who argue against large-scale immigration are responsible for racist murders. I mean, that really is low.
Yes.
No. Okay.
Yes.
There are always going to be nutters in our society.
I'm aware
right?
that there's always okay, so what? That these things happen in a vacuum? They happen away from the structure of society? And the fact that you and people like you have been putting this stuff on the front pages of newspapers for decades.
Oh,
and it has consequences,
and politicians,
you should own up to it.
There is a perfectly reasonable response to, perfectly reasonable for most people in this country to think that immigration has been too high. 75% of the population think it's either been much too high or just too high for 15 years. And you're saying that you know
live in areas
better.
Where there is very, very little actual migration.
What do you mean? We have had massive, by historical standards, we've had absolutely massive
located in cities which tend to be very, very pro-migration. The vast majority of migrants,
75% of the population, most of
this country live in cities.
No, you're wrong about that.
Now,
75% of the population. Now, that includes a lot of big cities. Now, 40% of London voted Brexit, I might remind you. I mean,